The human brain, as Vesalius was fond of pointing out, has the weight of 2 asses. Nevertheless, we continue to pretend that human behaviour is more or less understandable by equation. This is a problem that stems from a memorandum that Robert Hooke wrote to the Royal Society in London soon after its founding in 1660, in which he stated that the members of the Society should not meddle with divinity, metaphysics, morals, politics, grammar, rhetoric or logic. The primary purpose of the memorandum was to protect himself and his friends from attacks by church and state, but its prohibitions have had profound consequences that remain with us to this day. Hooke's compromise was to cede all forms of subjective thinking to the church, while saving objective measurements for the members of the society. From the moment the memorandum was passed, the arts and sciences drifted away from each other as slowly but surely as 2 tectonic plates.
Would you like to play the Kropotkin game? It goes something like this. Country A is wholly surrounded by just 1 territory. It is enclaved by Country B. Country C has 3 exclaves. One of these borders the sea, so it is a semi-enclave. If an exclave is bordered by 2 countries, it is not an enclave. But if an exclave is surrounded by just 1 state, it is also an enclave. Then there's the counter-enclave. And somewhere in the world, there is a counter-enclave. A state within a state that's nested within a state.
I'm not sure if I told you about this one. Maybe I did. I remember seeing Birdsong translated into 3 languages. For the Goldcrest, dullest of all was English. Z, Z, Z. The Estonians were a little closer to the mark. Tsi, Tsi, Tsi. But who's to say the Russians didn't have their ear closest to the ground with Tsu, Tsu, Tsu. For a language to be human, it must be possible to cry out, to reach beyond words to the non-language that precedes us and follows after us. Every sound of every language sooner or later slips away into silence. Presently there are 3 Russian phonemes on the verge of extinction. The front room, big window, a table. I have an atlas of the world open in front of me, part of an old Danish school primer. Vordingsburg, Preso, Naiso, Faxe, Karise, Koge, Denmark, Norge, poring over it, Sverige, the body. And on the double-page spread, I see how near Lithuania, Estonia and Latvia are to the Scandinavians. The colours are cool or infrared. The lakes of Finland, low green forests. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania, marsh and woodlands. It's worth noting that among the 5 symbols on the map key, 2 are for lighthouses. Fyrtårn, a conventional lighthouse, and Fyrskip, a light ship.
A beautiful object like an enormous diamond, with infinite facets and edges. The Fresnel lens extended the visibility of lighthouses with an intensity that was measured in thousands of candles, like horsepower, but in galloping light. Of modest means, his first experiments involved wires and cardboard. His mother kept bees, so a drop of honey filling a small hole served as a short focus lens that gave him an image of the sun. By the end of his short life, he had overturned the corpuscular theory of light.
In all the science I learned, which is less than a glass of vodka, many beautiful ideas were lost in the way that the words we use every day are lost because of familiarity. Words like stones that take on the heat of the sun or the cool of the moon. I was submerged in books and theories, turning the dial on an analog to digital amplifier, the controller of thunder and lightning, a very human Thor.
One winter evening in St. Petersburg, his eyes grew tired after reading for 5 hours. In his autobiography, he describes how the ciliary muscles of the eye contract, how the lens fattens as the printed word is forced onto the retina, how the muscles relax and the lens elongates as he lifts his eye from the page to the snow beyond the window. Each contraction is indirectly recorded by a pen attached to the ergograph. The rising and falling of the weight causes the pen to score a trace on smoked paper that is attached to a rotating cylinder. When he hears the dogs, the little bones in Pavlov's ears, the staples, through to the ossicles and the tiny hammer, trigger action potentials that enter the brain through a wave of activation. Once arrived, what then? How to describe the chain of events, from the vibrations in the air to the movement of the pen that touches the smoked paper? One constant rule of these traces is the inevitability of decline. Energy dissipates. Our hearts pump to maintain a core temperature that we are always losing. The sun will be the last to go, but its cooling is also guaranteed.
Tell me if you know this one. A mapmaker, a lepidopterist, and a neuroscientist walk into a bar. Vanya, do you want to play the Kropotkin game? Sure, says Vanya. How does it go? You have to get to Yevia with this passport. I know you speak 4 languages, but you can only use 2. If you come back alive, you win. How will you know that I've been to Yevia? Vanya, I trust you. But just in case, you can tell me its coat of arms. You'll find it to the right of the Ottoman Gate, to the left of the Tower of Flies. Country A is wholly surrounded by another country, so it is enclaved by Country B. Country C has 3 exclaves. One of these borders sea, so it is a semi-enclave.
If an exclave is bordered by 2 countries, it is not an enclave. But if an exclave is surrounded by just 1 state, it is also an enclave. Yevia is both an exclave and an enclave. Andorra is not. Andorra is neither an exclave nor an enclave. It is a sovereign principality. But that's another story.
I was hitchhiking to the start of a trail in Andorra. A Catalan lepidopterist, Andreu, picked me up somewhere between Sor and Les Cieux d'Urgell. Les Cieux d'Urgell is the home of the Bishop of Urgell, the ex officio co-prince of Andorra, a title he shares with the President of France. The principality still pays a cuestilla to its co-rulers, consisting of 4 hams, 40 loaves of bread, and some wine. Anyway, this is part of the story of Andorra, which is also a kind of archipelago, an island in the sky. Andreu told me much about Pyrenean butterflies as we ran around a grassy col that afternoon. He had a butterfly net in his hand. I was following close behind with a taxonomic book that he'd given me in the car. He was appalled at my ignorance. How do you define an insect? I wasn't sure. How many legs does this butterfly have? He was holding a Blanca de la Colle by the wings. To his dismay, I counted 5. As if to quieten his irritation, he unrolled the proboscis of the butterfly with the tip of his pencil, and we watched as it curled up neatly again. His research was monitoring how certain species were being pushed to higher altitudes by rising temperatures. Beyond 3,000 meters, there's no more islands in the sky for butterflies to lay their eggs in the nettles that are their favorite breeding ground. The view from the col was spectacular. The city was tucked away around a corner, out of view. Before us, a vista like a green atlas, with jagged peaks and endless falls of rivers and valleys. It was then that he said, "I hate Andorra, but it is beautiful above 2,000 meters."
Scanners have two main modes of operation. Functional MRI studies the activation of neurons, a kind of oceanography for the storms and currents inside the brain. I was more interested in structural MRI, the mapping of the hemispheres, simple cartography. If there are multiple scans, each brain must be transformed into a common space. Cartographers project our world into a more or less folktale ideal. A map from the 15th century looks like a frozen embryo.
In neuroscience, there's Talarak space and MNI space, Brodmann areas and Broca's area. There are always debates about the pros and cons of different maps, with their attendant nationalist fervour. Oxford favouring one, Harvard another. I remember reading a note on Talarak space where the authors state that it's based on a single post-mortem of the brain of a French woman who had quite an atypical brain. She was also an alcoholic. For many years, her brain became the standard space. Which reminds me that once upon a time my own brain was the standard for a global autism project. One curious remit of the job was that I had to travel around to all the institutes to be scanned in all the scanners. My brain was called the Phantom Brain.
The first medical scanner I used was manufactured by Siemens. In 1857, Wilhelm Siemens invented the regenerative furnace, which led to a boom in the production of cheap glass. Until then, glass had been hand-blown, mostly green and brown and quite expensive. The sudden availability of cheap glass had many consequences, but one that historians rarely mention is the boom in the art of the ship in a bottle.
Before the arrival of the Siemens furnace, glass would have been too valuable to be used for such a frivolous art. But a ship in a bottle is a beautiful thing. On days of shore leave, sailors made them from the leftovers of drinking sessions. Matches and plug for mast and hull, a torn shirt for a sail, and then traded them for cigarettes and beer. Whenever I see a patient being reversed into the bore of a magnet, I can't help thinking of a ship in a bottle.
A porthole window, a glass eye halved like a glass fruit, microscope and telescope at once. Midway through the morning, a squirrel clatters on the roof, while my eyes focused on a little thing, a caterpillar on a branch. All is camouflage here in Thicket County. All is heat and mulch. Cyclones come and go, while I bring a cup of coffee from my galley kitchen to the deck with its mesh of screens and wood. Housed in wickerwork cool, Fowls Fauna, maybe the only name I've learned, but I have no need of names to say I love this shade, this burning glass, this sweet, ripe mulch, this bitter root of silence that is a human silence. I am a cricket inside a cage, the way crickets fall quiet when a stranger comes sniffing round the trees. I hear the birds in the canopy. That squirrel again. Such a racket he makes on the corrugated roof. Even that butterfly. I think I can hear its wings. The rays are so defined. I draw each and every one. Bless that little globe, that glass eye halved like a ripe fruit. Beneath the faceted eye, I make the most of the morning before everything bursts into flames.
The gold foil experiment, where all the electrons pass through, except the ones that have made a head-on collision with the nuclei in the foil. The surprise here is the deflection, the return of those handful of alpha particles that have hit the nuclei in the thin layer of gold. Rutherford said that it was like seeing a cannonball rebounding from a spider's web. Whereas my wonder was always what they took for granted. 99% of particles passed through the gold foil. That it was not gold foil at all, but empty space. Pneuma. Vacuum. Fog. Whatever word your religion has for this.
And then, turning back to the north, a child has written Nord at the top of the page. Iceland is called Island. After Iceland comes Greenland. Inside Greenland, Kong Christian IX land, Kong Frederick VII land, the settlement of Thule. Dashed lines indicate the journeys of polar explorers. Peary, 1892. Knud Rasmussen, 1912. Koch, 1913. Nansen, 1888. Next comes a double spread. You have to turn the book on its side to read it properly. Scandinavia in the top half, the Baltics below. The same child's hand, Syd for south, scribbled below Warsaw.
Nansen supervised the building of the boat, stocked it with enough food to last an indeterminably long time. He predicted that if he got himself north of the Nova Zembla Islands, the Arctic currents would bring boat and men all the way to the North Pole. Drifting north, at one point the movement of the ice floe is so tediously slow that he makes a rough calculation that it might take them 5 years to reach the pole. A curious mix of interminable boredom and spectacular aurora. The moon, he wrote, sometimes has rings around it, with mock moons and axes, accompanied by rather strange phenomena. Faint rainbows are often to be seen in shimmering light fields. Yellow is generally the strongest tint near the horizon, passing into red and then blue. Sometimes there are 2 large rings, and then there may be 4 mock moons. These various ring formations are produced by the refraction of rays by minute ice crystals floating in the air. Later, after he left Fram with sled and kayak, he spent 3 months of overwintering on Franz Josef Land, surviving on birds and seals, living in a hole which he called the Hole.
They found the grasshopper, minted like a coin in the lava crust, 60 million years old, a while since he'd last seen the earth. Angle of thorax, wings, and throat, they drew him up with the blueprints of a spacecraft, blue and yellow and gold.
All that was left to resurrect was the sound. Knowing all the joints, they could simulate a waveform that was last heard on the earth long before our ears had evolved. This music, if it is music at all, was used to attract females. A queer proximity to then and now, the sawing of the air, an X-ray of the Garden of Eden held up to the light by an astronomer who was studying the Big Bang. All is illuminated by the arrival of light from galaxies that have long since fled. Now, remember the Kropotkin game?
If an exclave is bordered by 2 countries, it is not an enclave.
But if an exclave is surrounded by just one state, it is also an enclave.
Evia is both an exclave and an enclave. Andorra is not.
Andorra is neither an exclave nor an enclave. It is a sovereign principality, owned by the Bishop of Bourges and the President of France.
There's also a counter-enclave.
And somewhere in the world, there's a counter-enclave.
A state within a state that's nested within a state.
There's no reason why an exclave should not become the seat of an émigré government. At the end of the Spanish Civil War, Evia might once again have reasserted the power of words. But those dreams are gone.